And we're starting things off with Alan Leger, aka the Monster of Miramichi. Born in 1948 in New Brunswick, this guy committed a robbery with 2 accomplices in 1986 that resulted in the brutal beating of both of the owners, who were an elderly couple, one of which, the husband, John Glending, did not survive. The trio were arrested, and Leger began serving time at the Atlantic Institution Maximum Security Penitentiary. In 1989, he was transported to a hospital due to an ear infection, and it was there that he would make his escape. He pleaded with the guards to allow him to go to the washroom alone, and somehow he managed to get them to agree. Once he was inside the bathroom, he pulled out the small sharpened piece of metal he'd hidden up his rear, and picked the lock to his handcuffs. He fled from the hospital, and through a series of carjackings managed to avoid being captured for 7 whole months. And he didn't lay low during this time either. He took the lives of 4 more people in completely random attacks. He burnt a victim's home down with 2 sisters inside, attacked another woman, Annie Flam, and her sister. This sister managed to make it out alive, and he took the life of Reverend Father James Smith. He was finally arrested again though, and remains in prison till this day. Number 9, Nikolai Zamugliev, aka Metal Fang. Nikolai took the lives of at least 5 women, engaging in brutal acts of violence that shocked the nation. He would then consume some of the body parts of his victims. His crimes earned him the nickname Metal Fang due to the dental work he used to bite his victims. He'd lost some of his teeth in a fight when he was younger, being fitted with metal dentures. In 1979, he was finally captured and sent to a mental hospital. He was released in just less than a year though, and guess what? He took the lives of 3 more victims, the last of which was actually a friend of his. He invited some friends over for a dinner party, and at one point, guests found him in the next room, having crouched next to his friend, eating him. He would spend 8 years in a treatment center, but while being transported to another facility in 1989, he managed to escape. He managed to stay hidden for years, living in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. He likely would have been found if it weren't for the fact that he got tired of this life and basically turned himself in. He remains housed in a specialized psychiatric clinic to this day. Next on the list is Gonzalo Lopez. Lopez was a convicted criminal with multiple life sentences. He made his escape from prison in May 2022, serving life terms for taking the life of Jose Ramirez in 2006 and the shooting of 2 police officers. Lopez saw an opportunity during a hospital transfer. While being transported with 15 other inmates, he seized the moment, stabbing the corrections officer before making off with the vehicle. Police shot the tires, but he managed to drive for another mile before crashing it and then fleeing into the forest. Lopez remained a fugitive, managing to evade law enforcement for several weeks. Tragically, on June 2nd, he resurfaced at a family ranch in Centerville, Texas, where he committed a horrific act, resulting in the deaths of 5 individuals, 66-year-old Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren. The manhunt for Lopez intensified, and later that same day, a shootout between Lopez and the police broke out. In the end, Lopez got what he deserved, and no officers were harmed.
In our 7th spot, we have Ian Brady. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and his accomplice tortured, abused, and killed 5 individuals. They would bury their bodies on the moors outside of Manchester, which gave them the name the Moors Murderers. The crimes they committed were horrific, and Brady expressed no remorse. As a result, he was held in solitary confinement. His only contact with the outside world was through letters. It's said that on his free time he would memorize whole pages of Shakespeare and Plato and then recite them to himself. He would also often interact with television programs. Brady died in prison on May 15th, 2017 at the age of 79. Making our way down the list, number 6, we have Dennis Rader. Between the years of 1974 to 1991, American serial killer Dennis Rader took the lives of 10 individuals. In 2005, he was convicted for his crimes, and now he's facing 175 years in solitary confinement without the possibility of parole. Now, Dennis likes to go by the name BTK, or the BTK Strangler, which stands for Bind 'em, Torture 'em, and Kill 'em. So that says a lot about who this guy is. But thankfully, he is locked away and has no chance of escaping. To this day, Dennis is considered one of the most diabolical serial killers in American history. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with John Massey. In 1975, John Massey got into a fight with a pub's bouncer and he shot him in the chest. At the age of 26, he was sentenced to life for murder. But while in prison, Massey managed to successfully escape 3 times. His most notorious escape was when he made a makeshift rope out of sheets and a pair of heavy-duty gloves to climb over the prison wall. As a result of his escapes, he was placed in solitary confinement. He was allowed 15 minutes outside of his cell each day, and had only 8 minutes for a phone call. Other than that, he was kept locked away. He is considered one of Britain's longest serving prisoners. He was eventually released after spending nearly 43 years behind bars. In our 4th spot, we have Thomas Silverstein. Thomas Edward Silverstein was an American criminal jailed for armed robbery in 1978. But while in prison, he committed numerous other crimes. In 1983, he killed a prison officer who he stabbed multiple times. Then he murdered 2 inmates. As a result, he had to be detained in a specially designed cell at the ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary in Colorado. Due to the crimes he committed while in jail, he is considered the most violent prisoner in America. He is also referred to as America's most isolated man. Now, Silverstein was considered so dangerous that he got transferred to a federal prison in Atlanta. There he was confined in a 6 by 7 foot cell. He was constantly under surveillance. In fact, the lights in his cell were never turned off so that they could always keep an eye on him. Silverstein eventually died in prison at the age of 67. He is said to have served the longest term in solitary confinement in the federal penitentiary system. Coming in at number 3, we have Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos, often referred to as the Damsel of Death, was found guilty of killing 7 men. She claimed it was self-defense, but then later pleaded guilty to the murders. She would murder them, rob them, and then drive home in their cars. Due to this, she was named America's first female serial killer. Now, Eileen was placed in solitary confinement for quite some time, but then she started to grow paranoid. She thought that the people making her food were spitting in it, and then she also claimed that she was being attacked by a sonic weapon. As a result, she wanted the court to hurry up with her death sentence. On October 9th, 2002, Eileen died by lethal injection. Moving on to number 2, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, otherwise known as the Countess who bathed in blood, was a serial killer in Hungary back in the 16th century. It's believed that she had killed around 650 girls. She's also considered the most vicious female serial killer in all recorded history. It's believed that her husband was a big influence in her killings. Apparently, he told her to torture her servants. He said for her to pour honey all over them and then let the bugs eat them. But her killings didn't truly start until she met a witch named Anna Darvula. This witch told Elizabeth that bathing in the blood of the young would help her maintain her youth. And that's exactly what she would do. Eventually, Elizabeth was sentenced to life in solitary confinement. She was locked up in her castle's torture chamber. The windows and doors were boarded up with her inside. There was only a small hole in which food was passed in through. On August 21st, 1611, she passed away. And in our number 1 spot, we have Robert Maudsley. Now, I've talked about Robert in my other video on dangerous criminals, and there's no way that I couldn't include him on this list. Robert Maudsley is considered Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Maudsley was originally convicted for 1 murder, however killed 3 more individuals in prison, which got him placed in solitary confinement. In 1977, Maudsley and his fellow inmate held another prisoner hostage. They ended up torturing him for 9 hours before cracking his head open and killing him. Now, it's rumored that he may have ate some of that prisoner's brain. As a result, he was deemed the real-life Hannibal Lecter. After that, he murdered 2 more inmates, which got him placed in solitary confinement. In fact, he is locked up in a glass cell underneath Wakefield Jail. He spends 23 hours of his day there.
And we're starting off with Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph is known for his involvement in a series of bombings in the United States during the 1990s. These acts, violence which targeted innocent civilians, were carried out due to his twisted political agenda. He was setting out to purify a world he believed was sinful, wanting to get rid of those he felt were undeserving of God's love. His most notorious attack was the bombing at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, where he planted an explosive that killed one person and injured over 100 others. In addition to the Olympic attack, Rudolph was responsible for a string of attacks at clinics and lesbian nightclub. He was motivated by pure hatred, just wanting to further his agenda through violence. And what makes Rudolph's case even more disturbing is the fact that he managed to evade capture for years, fueling this ongoing anxiety and fear in the communities he targeted. He was finally arrested in 2003 though, now serving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Next up we have Dennis Rader. This guy is just pure evil, plain and simple. He'd call himself BTK. As for what that stands for, just Google it. Pretty messed up that someone would be proud to refer to themselves that way. He committed a series of heinous crimes over several decades in Wichita, Kansas. Rader's deeds, which included the brutal unalivings of innocent people, just showed a complete disregard for human life. And what makes his case even more disturbing was his ability to blend into society as this seemingly average, unsuspecting neighbor and family man. He was a church leader, a facade which allowed him to gain the trust of his victims. And this is like part of why when people make claims after someone does something really terrible, like, oh, he never could have done something like that, he was so normal, he was so upstanding, so blah blah blah. Evil comes in many forms and wears many different masks. That's why it's so insidious. Now, Rader's obsession with power and control over others led to him to commit unspeakable acts, but his evil extended beyond the physical harm he inflicted. He also taunted law enforcement and the public through these chilling letters and messages, just reveling in the fear and torment he was creating. Number 8, Charles Cullen. So this guy was a nurse, and he's on this list. So this is one of those creepy cases where someone working in the medical field is secretly harming their patients. People have put their complete trust and faith in them. Really sickening. Over the course of his nursing career, he administered lethal doses of medications to patients under his care, ultimately causing the deaths of an estimated 40 or more patients, possibly even in the hundreds. His crimes spanned across multiple hospitals, making it tough for authorities to initially identify the extent of his actions. And as for his motivations, they remain somewhat murky, but it is clear that he derived some form of satisfaction from exerting control over life and death within this hospital setting. Families were left devastated, and fellow hospital staff were confused and began to become suspicious of the sudden and unexpected deaths of these patients. And ultimately, Cullen's spree ended when he was arrested in 2003. He's now serving 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole until 2403. The American justice system is really weird. Like, just say he's never getting out.
Number 7 brings us to Joseph Edward Duncan III. He is a convicted murderer and sex offender who began committing his violent sexual assaults on other children when they were only a teenager. When he was younger, he admitted to his therapist that he had raped 13 younger boys by the time he was 16 years old. I mean, is this real life right now? He was arrested and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but when he was paroled, he killed at least 3 other children after he had sexually assaulted them. Once he was released again, which I have no idea why he was, he invaded a family home, killed the parents, and kidnapped the children. He molested the children and filmed it all on camera. After killing these poor children, he was arrested and sentenced to the death penalty. My question is, why are they still keeping him alive? George M.L. Banks comes in on this list at number 6. He shot 13 people to death, including 7 children. So the 7 children were killed, and their mothers, and also 1 bystander. 5 of those children were his own kids. His attorney tried to argue that he was mentally insane, but he was convicted of 12 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. He has actually avoided death twice, because it was determined that at the time he was set to be executed, he was deemed incompetent. I don't understand this. He was convicted of the crime, and this is his punishment. Why does he need to be deemed competent to be killed? Why are there rules for someone who's on death row? You have to wait so long to kill them. Number 5 brings us to Bobby Joe Long. He is responsible for abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering at least 10 women in Florida back in 1984. During an 8-month period, he was averaging 1 murder every other week, and he would dump his victims' bodies and left them in strange positions, tied with ropes. He released his last victim after he raped her for a period of 26 hours, and she gave valuable information to the police that led to his arrest. In total, Bobby Joe Long has 1 5-year sentence, 4 99-year sentence, 28 life sentences, and 1 death sentence. Now, at number 4, we have Charles. He was found guilty of multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, torture, and murder. He was convicted of 11 murders, and he would take his victims to a lake cabin where he built in a dungeon room. According to court records, Charles and his accomplice abducted their neighbors, killed the men and babies, but kept the women alive. They would rape and torture them before killing them or waiting until they died from their injuries. Thankfully, he is currently on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Djorkaeff Tsarnaev explodes into number 3. He was given the death penalty after he planted the bombs at the Boston Marathon. And this took place back in 2013. The bombs killed 3 people and injured approximately 280 others. He later told the FBI that he had intended to detonate a series of explosions in Times Square. So after the Boston Marathon happened, they were making their way to New York and they were gonna set off more bombs. He has spent the last 3 years of his life on death row at ADX Florence in Colorado. Number 2 takes us to Randy Stephen Kraft. He raped, tortured, and murdered at least 13 men between the ages of 13 to 35 years old in California. It is believed that he killed a total of 67 victims, but he was only convicted and charged with 16 murders. He would give his victims high levels of alcohol and tranquilizers, tie them up, torture them, and sexually abuse them before he would strangle them. There are other disturbing and gruesome details to his murders, but I don't want to get into all of that because they are insane. He is currently on death row in San Quentin State Prison in California, one of the toughest prisons in the world. Finally, in at number 1 spot, we have Rodney Alcala. He is a dangerous convicted rapist and serial killer who was sentenced to death in California back in 2010 for 5 murders that he committed in the 1970s. His exact victim count is unknown, but it is estimated that he raped and killed over 100 people. He used to toy with his victims by strangling them until they lost consciousness. He would wait until they wake up and then repeat this process many times before killing them. Despite receiving 3 separate death sentences, he is still alive and he has been waiting on death row for the past 8 years.
Starting us off at number 10 is John Justin Bunting. Known as the ringleader for the infamous Snowtown killings, Bunting is responsible for the death of 11 people in South Australia between 1992 and 1999. John Justin Bunting was a troubled man known to have an intense hatred for homosexuals as well as people interested in minors. And while I think we can all agree that it's understandable he hated those interested in minors, the problem is that he never had any proof that his victims were criminals of such things and would just assume they were because they were also gay. Most of his victims were either friends, roommates, or relatives, and along with his 3 other conspirators, he would kidnap the victims, then torture them in various sick ways before taking their lives. The case was uncovered when the remains of 8 people were found in barrels of acid in Snowtown, Australia. Then 3 days later, 2 more victims were found buried in a backyard. Allegedly, their final victim was fried and eaten by Bunting and his gang. After a series of trials, Bunting was ultimately declared the ringleader and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The others faced similar charges, each serving 1 life sentence per charge, and these monsters will thankfully be locked up until their last days. Next up at number 9, Andre Thomas. Early on in life, Andre was unfortunately very badly abused by his mother and began to experience crushing auditory hallucinations at the age of 10. Then in 1999, while in grade 9, he met Laura, who soon became pregnant and brought Andre Jr. into the world later that year. Now with a son, Andre decided to drop out of high school and get a job to support his family, and by the age of 18, he and Laura finally married. The marriage, however, was short-lived, as Laura quickly caught on to the realities of his mental health issues and separated from Andre 4 months later. Tragically, however, the separation took a devastating toll on Andre's not yet diagnosed condition, which began convincing him that Laura was Jezebel and Andre Jr. was the Antichrist, and that he had to kill them. Finally, in March of 2004, Andre broke into her apartment and killed the entire family, each with a separate blade, as he claimed he did not want to contaminate their blood and allow the demons inside of them to live. After the incident, he attempted to take his own life. However, when that didn't go to plan, he removed one of his eyes instead. Eventually, after a long trial, he was sentenced to death for his crimes, until 3 years later when he removed his remaining eye and ingested it. While his sentence did not change officially, this incident catapulted Andre to be relocated to a psych ward, as he was eventually seen as not adequately fit to be executed. Coming in at number 8, the Icebox Killer. On June 2nd, 1991, 23-year-old Denise attended a concert in LA and began making her way home to Orange County around 2 a.m. However, the next morning, when her parents, who she lived with, woke to find she wasn't there, they called police to make sure she hadn't been in an accident or hurt somehow. But all that was found was Denise's car on the side of a freeway with a drained battery, and for 3 years, no one had any clue where she was. That was until July of 1994, when a woman arrived at the house of a man named John Femarello to purchase some paint. While there, she saw what appeared to be a very old rental car in her driveway, and after getting a strange feeling about him, she reached out to authorities, who determined the car was stolen. Still not connecting the two incidents, a police officer arrived on site to speak to John about the stolen vehicle. But when he arrived, he noticed an electrical cord running to a freezer from the back of the truck. Initially believing he was running some kind of lab, the deputy reached out to a locksmith to open the back of the truck, but to his horror, the body of a young, beaten, and tortured woman was inside, who was later determined to be the missing woman, Denise Huber. And tragically, after investigating the property, it became evident she had likely not been his only victim. John was convicted and sentenced to death in 1997 and remains locked up in California awaiting his fate.
Number 7. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy kidnapped, took advantage of, and ended the lives of dozens of young women during the 1970s and possibly earlier. Ted often employed his charm to disguise his intentions when kidnapping victims, and extended this tactic to law enforcement, the media, and the criminal justice system to maintain his claims of innocence. He typically approached women in public places, either asking for help by faking an injury or impersonating an authority figure. Once tricked into being led away, they would then be bludgeoned unconscious and taken elsewhere to be taken advantage of and eventually die. In 1975, he was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. The day before his execution, he told Dr. James Dobson, "Serial killers do not stand out in a crowd, and if gone unnoticed, look just like the average person. As we serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, and we grew up in regular families, which is just chilling." Then while in prison after more than a decade of denials, Ted also confessed to ending the lives of more than 30 people committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978, but experts estimate the real number could exceed 100. Number 6. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was truly an evil man. He committed so many crimes, most of them the unthinkable. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, Carl confessed to having committed the deaths of 21 boys and men, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He is suspected of having ended the lives of more than 100 boys and men in the United States alone. He also confessed to have committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of males of all ages. He wrote, "In my lifetime, I have
have murdered 21 human beings, I have committed thousands of burglaries, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all those things, I am not the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me. I hate the whole damned human race, including myself. Number 5. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper ended the lives of 10 people. These included his own mother and her best friend, his grandparents, and female college students hitchhiking in the vicinity of Santa Cruz County, California. He targeted the young female hitchhikers during his spree by luring them into his vehicle and driving them to secluded areas where he would end their lives before taking their corpses back to his home to be decapitated, dismembered, and violated. While speaking with Front Page Detective magazine, Edmund explained his thought process when finding his victims, saying, "One side of me says I'd like to talk to her, date her. The other side of me says I wonder what her head would look like on a stick." He also said, "The first time I had sex with a dead body, it makes you sick to your stomach." Number 4. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee where he would then dismember them. It had been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Jeffrey's bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in his apartment, the investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life, and he was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Now, while in jail, he talked about eating people and famously said, "I ate someone with a tattoo once. The ink made the meat taste like shh. Eat garlic to avoid vampires, get tattoos to avoid cannibals." So, there you have it. Tattoos can save you from those who eat other humans. Number 3. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton ended the lives and took advantage of many as a former pig farmer who is suspected of being one of the most prolific criminals in Canadian history. After dropping out of school, Robert left a butcher's apprenticeship to begin working full-time at his family's pig farm. He is believed to have begun ending people's lives in the early 1980s after inheriting the farm. Arrested in 2002, he was convicted in 2007 of the second-degree homicide of 6 women and was also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other deaths. Robert was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Robert had confessed to 49 deaths to an undercover agent from the Office of Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that Robert told the officer he wanted to end the life of another woman to make an even 50 and that he was caught because he was sloppy, which is just chilling. Number 2. Joe Metheny. Joe Metheny ended the lives and took advantage of many people in the Baltimore, Maryland area. While he had claimed to end the lives of 13 people, sufficient evidence was only found to convict him of 2 homicides. Research later confirmed 3 more victims, though he had not been charged with them. According to Joe, after spending time with his victims, he felt himself compelled to strangle the women. He claimed that he used his victims' bodies to create ground beef, which he then sold at barbecues, which literally makes me want to throw up. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences for the deaths and served nearly 2 decades before dying behind bars in 2017. Now, a scary comment from him showed him how evil he really was, as he said, "The words I'm sorry will never come out, for they would be a lie." It is so crazy to me that someone could do those horrific things and feel nothing about the matter. And coming in at number 1 is Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, the members of the cult believed that he was Jesus Christ and followed everything he said. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, he has been clear that he has no remorse, as he once said. Remorse for what? You people have done everything in the world to me, doesn't that give me equal right? I can do anything I want to you people at any time I want to because that's what you've done to me. Maybe I should have slain 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then I would have felt that I really offered society something. You've got it stuck in your brain that I slayed somebody. What do you want to call me a slayer for? I've never slain anyone, I don't need to, I think it, I have it here.
Starting off with this disturbing list, in at number 10 with Lisa Montgomery. Unlike the others on this list, Lisa has only committed 1 murder, but it is pretty disturbing and a sickening murder. So on a chat room, she pretended to buy a dog from a pregnant woman, but when they met face to face, Lisa strangled the pregnant woman, she cut her open and kidnapped the infant from her womb. She went back home and tried to pass off this baby as her own. The internet's first serial killer makes its way into number 9. John Edwards Robinson made contact with most of his victims in an online chat room. He lured several women from the chat room with his username, the Slave Master. He is a convicted serial killer, con man, kidnapper, and forager who was found guilty in 2003 for 3 murders that he committed in Kansas. He was given the death sentence for 3 murders, but the police believed that he was involved with as many as 8 other murders. Up next, at number 8, Richard Fairley. He is a stalker and a convicted mass murderer who killed 7 people and wounded 4 others. He spent 4 years aggressively stalking one of his co-workers, Laura Black, so she was forced to get a restraining order against him. So on the day of the hearing, to make the restraining order permanent, he loaded up his RV with 100 pounds of weaponry. He drove to his old workplace and started shooting people with his gun. He even tried to kill Laura Black, but she was able to escape into a parking lot after he shot her twice. However, 7 unlucky people died that day and he was sentenced to death back in 1992.
Number 7. The Texas 7. Texas 7 was a group of 7 convicts who pulled off a prison escape in December of 2000. These inmates serving sentences for various crimes were all going to be in prison for a long time, and feeling like they had nothing to lose, they planned an escape. They managed to overpower and subdue prison employees at the John B. Connolly unit in Kennedy, Texas. Using stolen weapons and clothing, they took advantage of a maintenance truck's cover and made their getaway. Their escape set off a massive manhunt across Texas. The group was on the run for over a month, committing a series of robberies and other crimes to help sustain themselves. They even took the life of a police officer during a robbery. The Texas 7's run came to an end though on January 22nd, 2001 in Woodland Park, Colorado, when a tip led authorities to their hideout. There'd been an episode, I believe, I can't remember the show, Unsolved Mysteries or something, where they showed them and like a bunch of people phoned in being like, I think I've seen those guys. Anyway, there was a standoff with law enforcement. One member took his own life and the rest were apprehended. The majority of them are now on death row. Next up, we have Sharon Kinney. Unlike most of the criminals on this list, Sharon has still yet to be found. Suspected of being responsible for the deaths of 3 individuals, including her husband, James, and the wife of a boyfriend in 1960. Kinney's actions led to a series of trials. She faced 3 unsuccessful attempts at prosecution for the death of her husband. As the 4th trial loomed, Kinney made a bold move and fled off to Mexico to evade justice, and while in Mexico, she became involved in yet another deadly encounter, claiming self-defense when she shot and killed a man, but Mexican authorities, they just weren't buying it, and she ended up being convicted, landing her in Mexican prison with a 13-year sentence. On December 7th, 1969, just 4 years into her sentence, she capitalized on the facility's lax security measures. There was also a prison blackout, which helped, and she ended up making her escape, slipping away into the night, never to be seen again. To this day, Sharon Kinney remains at large, holding one of the longest outstanding warrants in American history. At our number 5 spot, Richard Matt and David Sweat were 2 dangerous inmates who pulled off a daring escape from Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York in 2015. These criminals used cunning and tools to cut through steel walls and pipes within their cells, and over a period of months they created this series of tunnels and passages within the prison's walls, leading to the catwalks and utility tunnels. On the night of June 6, 2015, Matt and Sweat made their move. They crawled through the labyrinth of passages they'd made, emerging through a manhole cover outside the prison's walls. Of course, a manhunt was launched with law enforcement across the state and beyond joining in on the hunt. They managed to evade capture for a number of weeks, robbing cabins and seeking refuge in the wilderness. Richard Matt lost his life at the hands of law enforcement on June 26th. David Sweat was captured again 2 days later, weakened and suffering from gunshot wounds. Next on the list is Donald Leroy Evans. This guy was an absolute despicable prick. He took the lives of multiple people between 1985 and 1991. The true extent of these crimes I can't get into. He did more than just strangle people to death, though. He would usually attack his victims at rest stops and public parks, and even though he was initially only connected to 3 cases, he later admitted to being responsible for the unsolved deaths of 70 other people across 22 states. In June of 1993, while in custody at Harrison County Jail, he managed to escape along with 3 other inmates. Luckily, it didn't take the cops long to find him. He had been hiding out in a shed. Evans ended up getting the death penalty, but his death would come much quicker than it likely would have. Thankfully, he was stabbed in the shower by a fellow death row inmate in 1999. And at number 3, Alexander Solonik, nicknamed Russian Jackal and Alexander the Great. This guy was a Russian mob hitman and was damn good at his job. He was also really good at escaping from prison apparently, which he did a number of times. The long arm of justice had finally caught up with him and he was arrested, but he managed to escape out of the courthouse window, fleeing to Siberia. He was caught and arrested again, spending 2 years in jail for escaping through the ventilation system. He went back to working as a hitman, but after a shootout in 1995, he was arrested once again in Moscow. The mob managed to bribe a guard to help him escape this time, and he exited his cell, scaling the wall with help of a rope and some climbing gear, and then entered into a waiting BMW. He headed to Greece, where he intended to spend the rest of his days, I guess, and that's exactly what happened, only he didn't live as long as he wanted or expected to. The mob wanted to tie up any loose ends and enlisted one of Solonik's very own friends, a fellow hitman, to take him out. This guy sounds like the real-life John Wick or something. Next on the list we have James Earl Ray. Ray, who was serving a 99-year prison sentence for killing civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., managed to escape from prison for a second time on August 7th of 1997. This escape occurred at the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee. Ray and 6 other inmates managed to escape, but their freedom was short-lived as law enforcement launched a massive manhunt, and just 3 days later, on June 13th, he was recaptured in a wooded area about 8 miles from the prison. His second escape was not as successful as his first. Had also been in prison for something else before that incident and managed to escape for months or something like that. Ultimately, though, led to tighter security measures in the prison system, and Ray would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying in prison in 1998. Finally, though, at number 1, we have Ted Bundy. If you want to talk about one of the most notorious criminals in American history, this guy was definitely one of them. Managed to escape authorities on 2 separate occasions. In 1977, Ted Bundy pulled off 2 daring escapes from custody. The first escape took place in Aspen, where he was awaiting trial. Bundy decided to represent himself in court, which gave him access to the law library at Pickens County Courthouse. And on June 7th, he made his move. Unshackled and unguarded, he jumped out of a second-floor window of the courthouse. Took authorities 6 days to catch him again. The second escape happened later that same year, on December 30th. While he was incarcerated, Bundy managed to carve a hole in the ceiling of his cell. Through his makeshift tunnel, he crawled to freedom. Not only was this guy a truly evil human being, but he was cunning and resourceful on top of it. Not a good combination. Good for him, but not good for everyone else.
Number 10. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was a prostitute who ended the lives of many men in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot dead and robbed 7 of her male clients. She claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. She had no remorse for these men and said, "I want the world to know I killed these men as cold as ice. I've hated humans for a long time. I am a serial killer." This really shows how she had no remorse for her actions and that she didn't really commit these crimes as self-defense. Number 9. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Albert once boasted his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Winchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it." Now this is truly disturbing, and I can't imagine how the mother felt receiving that letter. Number 8. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929 in the city of Dusseldorf. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. This made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the blood dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf. She reported him to the police and he was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the charges, but he was found guilty of everything and sentenced to death. Peter displayed no emotion as the sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded. Now this isn't a confession, but more of a question, but it is so gross. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Wow, that is just disgusting.
Next up, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, infamously known as the Son of Sam, committed a string of brutal crimes in the mid-70s that terrorized New York City. He was responsible for a series of shootings that left 6 people dead and several others injured. Berkowitz's actions were driven by a twisted compulsion that led him to randomly target innocent victims, mostly young couples and parked cars. What makes Berkowitz's crimes particularly chilling and very bizarre is his claim that he was following the orders of his neighbor's dog, which he believed was possessed by a demon. I think he was pinning the whole demon possession thing on the wrong place. I was going to say on the wrong person, but a dog, not really a person. What really made this guy so scary though was just how random his attacks were and his ability to elude capture for an extended period, which left New Yorkers living in dread for this possible next attack. Berkowitz was finally apprehended in 1977, and he is currently serving 6 consecutive life sentences, just in case he dies and is reborn again. Number 6, Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway Ridgway, commonly known as the Green River Killer, is a notorious criminal who terrorized the state of Washington during the 80s and 90s. He was responsible for the unalivings of at least 49 women, although he later confessed to taking the lives of even more victims. Ridgway carried out his crimes by targeting vulnerable women, primarily workers of the night and runaways, whom he would lure, often by showing them pictures of his son to gain their trust before violently attacking them and discarding them like trash in remote locations. What makes Ridgway's crimes even more horrifying is the cold-blooded and calculated manner in which he hunted his victims. He often even returned to the dumping grounds, and as to what he did there, not something I can or want to get into here, but suffice to say, this guy belongs exactly where he is now. He managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades, but was finally apprehended in 2001 through DNA evidence and his own admissions. He struck a plea deal, providing information about the location of his victims' remains in exchange for a life sentence, avoiding the death penalty. Next on the list is Kristen Gilbert, another nurse. Over the course of several years, she intentionally administered fatal doses of medication to patients under her care, leading to their premature deaths. She would inject their IV bags with high doses of epinephrine, causing cardiac arrest. Nurses actually noticed a higher than normal amount of deaths with patients in her care, but initially just thought it was a coincidence and would give her the nickname Angel of Death as a joke. It's not uncommon for people working in very intense working environments like hospitals to have a bit of a dark sense of humor in order to cope, but in hindsight, that's pretty morbid. Imagine looking back on that after the fact, having made that joke and being like, oh damn, yeah, that was more accurate than we thought. She was very calculated in her actions, exploiting her position within the hospital. She used her authority to carry out her crimes, all while evading suspicion for a long time. In terms of her motivations for doing what she did, I mean, what possible motive would ever make sense for something like this? Maybe she had a desire for control, power. Doesn't really make a difference anyway. There's not really any motivation that would make any of this forgivable, let alone okay. Gilbert was eventually caught when coworkers started catching on to her, prompting an investigation that led to her arrest. And at number 4 is Wayne Williams. Born on May 27, 1958 in Atlanta, Williams grew up with an interest in radio and journalism. But his supposed connection to the Atlanta unaliving, specifically the homicides of 29 young people, both male and female, are what he's most well known for. Between 1979 and 81, a series of disappearances and discoveries of bodies in rivers and wooded areas shocked the Atlanta community. These victims displayed signs of strangulation or asphyxiation. In 1981, Wayne Williams came under police scrutiny when he was stopped on a bridge above the Chattahoochee River. During this encounter, investigators found fibers in his vehicle that were believed to match those discovered on some of the victims, and as a result, Williams was arrested and charged with the deaths of 2 adults, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Payne. In 1982, Williams faced trial and received 2 life sentences. Law enforcement were adamant that by apprehending Williams, they had also solved many of the cases involving the young people, even though he could only solely be tied to the 2 adult victims, and there was no real evidence to support his involvement in those other cases. His sentencing is still controversial to this day, as Williams claimed the KKK had actually been responsible. All of these victims, the 2 adults and the missing young people, had been African American, and Williams believed the true circumstances of the case had been covered up by authorities. Next up, we have Joseph D'Angelo Jr. D'Angelo Jr., a former police officer, gained infamy as the Golden State Killer, born on November 8, 1945 in Bath, New York. He would go on to commit a series of horrifying crimes that terrorized California communities from 1974 to 1986. His spree included burglaries, SA, and murders. He would often break into homes, tying up and terrorizing his victims before committing these acts. Over the years, his crimes remained unsolved. It was only in 2018 that he was finally arrested and identified through DNA evidence. In June of 2020, Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to numerous charges. On August 21st, 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be released to harm others again. Number 2, Robert Hansen. Born on February 15th, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, he operated in Anchorage, Alaska during the 70s and early 80s. Hansen's crimes primarily targeted young women. His method involved luring his victims with promises of money or employment. Then he would abduct and transport them to a remote wilderness area, and there, things would play out like a real-life horror movie. He would release them and then hunt them down like animals, subjecting them to unspeakable acts of violence. He is known to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, although the true number of his victims may be much higher. His crimes went undetected for years due to his careful planning and knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness, but his capture came in 1983 when one of his intended victims actually managed to escape. This led to a search of Hansen's property where evidence, including jewelry belonging to some of the missing women, was discovered. In February of 1984, Robert Hansen was arrested. In a plea agreement, he confessed to his crimes and provided information on the locations of his victims' remains. In return for his cooperation, Hansen received a 461-year prison sentence without the possibility of parole. And finally, we have the Ripper Crew. The Ripper Crew were a group of 4 individuals responsible for a series of gruesome crimes in Chicago during the early 80s. The group consisted of Robert Gett, Edward Spreitzer, Andrew Coco Reales, and Thomas Coco Reales, terrorizing the city with their gruesome acts of violence. Their crimes primarily involved the abduction and unaliving of women. The victims were subjected to unspeakable acts of violence. The group's name, Ripper Crew, was a name they coined themselves, as they would sometimes dismember their victims. It was even said they would consume parts of their body in ritualistic ceremonies. The members of the Ripper Crew were arrested in 1982 and 83 after law enforcement agencies launched an extensive investigation into their activities. Evidence including statements from the perpetrators themselves and the recovery of victims' remains linked them to the crimes. Everyone received proper sentences for the most part, but Thomas Coco Reales was released in 2019, and according to him, he's not a monster, which is incorrect.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Man in the Iron Mask. The Man in the Iron Mask is the name given to an unidentified prisoner arrested in 1669 or 1670. He was imprisoned during the reign of King Louis XIV of France. Now, what's so scary about this prisoner is how his identity was always kept unknown. He was forced to wear a mask that blocked off his face. Some say he wore a black velvet mask, while others reported that it was a full-on iron mask. Apparently, the guards were ordered to shoot this man if he ever removed the mask. On top of that, he was kept in solitary confinement with double doors. He spent the rest of his life there until he died on November 19th, 1703. Moving on to number 9, we have Jesse Pomeroy. Jesse Pomeroy, otherwise known as the Boston Boy Fiend or the Boy Torturer, was convicted of countless murders at the age of 14 in 1875. He would abuse, torture, and then kill his victims. In fact, he was the youngest person in the history of Massachusetts to be convicted of first-degree murder. When Jesse was caught, he admitted to the murders and was sentenced to live in the Westboro Boys Reform School until he was 18. However, while at the school, he went on to commit other murders. That's when he was sentenced to prison and was placed in solitary confinement. His only interactions were with his guard and his mom, who would visit him once a month. In our 8th spot, we have Ian Manuel. In 1990, when Ian Manuel was only 13 years old, he shot a woman in the face, blowing out part of her jaw during a robbery. Thankfully, she survived, but as a result of his crime, he was tried and convicted as an adult. As a result, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. He was one of the youngest inmates in the Tampa State Penitentiary. Manuel spent 15 plus years in isolation, making him the longest serving inmate in solitary confinement in Florida. Eventually, he was released after the woman he shot actually fought for his freedom, claiming everyone does dumb things when they're young, and she didn't want him to waste his life in jail.
Coming in at number 7, the pig farmer killer. Robert William Picton, or Willie, is a Canadian pig farmer responsible for killing 49 women between 1982 to 2002. Willie was known to be a fairly quiet and simple guy by his friends and family, and after his parents' death took over the family farm in 1980. But once he was in charge of the farm, he would soon become a monster. While it's not known exactly the detail of each crime, it's believed he would engage with escorts and then in the middle of, well, you know, would get extremely angry and blame them for thefts or crimes. The situation would escalate and he would ultimately handcuff the victims before attacking them and take their lives. But the creepiest part is that from there, he would take the bodies of his victims and put them through a wood chipper before feeding it to his pigs. And it's believed that some of the resulting bits would get mixed in with pork mince and sold to friends and family. Upon his 2002 arrest for his crimes, Willie admitted to all accounts and was even disappointed as he was trying to round out his tally to an even 50 prior to being caught. Willie was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 25 years, although it seems highly unlikely they are ever going to let him leave. Coming in at number 6, Randy Stephen Kraft. Between 1972 to 1983, Randy Stephen Kraft became known as the scorecard killer after being found responsible for the death of 16 young men in California. However, although only convicted of 16 victims, it's believed he harmed, tortured, and killed up to 67 men in the area. After high school graduation in 1963, Randy's plan was to become a US Senator, and so he enrolled in college for economics. However, through his college years, he began to distance himself from his previous dreams and started drinking, partying, and getting himself into trouble. After just barely graduating, Randy joined the US Air Force and rose to Airman First Class. However, by 1969, he was discharged after the Army discovered he was gay. Around this same time, Kraft became distant from his family as they did not really approve of his sexuality either, and by 1970, he committed his first known essay on a boy. The following years, Kraft became obsessed and would lure young men, often of military background, to his van, then and take advantage of them before torturing their bodies until death and dumping them along the nearest freeway. This pattern repeated for over 10 years until he was finally caught and sentenced to death, where he now remains locked up awaiting his inevitable fate. Next up at number 5, BTK. To the public and his community, he was a totally normal, polite, and well-mannered man. Rader was an active member of his church and was actually elected president of the church council and even volunteered as a Cub Scout leader. He had a wife and kids who would describe him as a totally average and nice guy. But Rader had a dark secret that would soon change everything. Despite his outward persona, he was actually a truly disturbed man and was into some pretty terrifying things in the bedroom that eventually leaked their way into his crimes. To start off, I'll give you a hint. BTK is an abbreviation that stands for bind, torture, kill. And it was disturbing things along those lines that he liked to do to, as he put it, trapped and helpless women. But if a woman wasn't available, he would take pictures of himself in women's clothing wearing a mask of a woman's face and bind himself, as he seemed to enjoy living out a fantasy as his own victims. Between 1974 to 1991, Dennis Rader killed 10 women in Wichita, Kansas, and was known to send taunting letters to the authorities and media describing his crimes in gruesome detail. There was then a strange hiatus in his crimes for about 10 years, but thankfully this creep was arrested in 2005 and is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each woman he killed. Coming in at number 4, George Emil Banks. Despite having a previous criminal record for an armed offense, Banks managed to get a job as a correctional officer in 1980. However, in 1982, Banks began worrying coworkers after he kept saying things like a race war would soon consume the world and that he wanted to protect his sons and daughters from the torment and agony of racism. Then, after a conflict with a supervisor, he was put on extended leave from the prison and ordered to be examined for for mental health issues. Not long after his mandated leave from work, Banks, having consumed massive amounts of and alcohol, tragically killed 13 people, 9 of which were his own family members, 3 former in-laws, and 1 bystander. Unbeknownst to Banks, his former brother-in-law was able to survive by hiding in the closet and called police to identify the attacker as Banks. Eventually, police were able to track him down at a friend's house, and after a 4-hour standoff, they were able to draw him out. During the trial, Banks explained his crimes by saying he did not want his offspring to be victimized in a race war, as he had suffered from racism much of his life as a biracial man. This explanation, however, did not sway the jury, and he was convicted to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Coming in at number 3, Joseph Fritzl. One of the most heartbreaking cases I have ever read about is the case of Joseph Fritzl. Born in 1935 in Austria, at 21 he married a girl named Rosemary, and the pair had a family of 7 together. Now, he was a very abusive man to everyone in his family, but especially Elizabeth. However, the peak of his cruelty began when Elizabeth was 18 and he lured her into the basement, where he trapped her for the next 24 years. In those 24 years, he assaulted her constantly, and during her imprisonment, she gave birth to 7 people. Of course, over the years, many were concerned about Elizabeth's disappearance, but Fritzl would lie and say that she ran off to join a cult, and that he had no clue where she was. One day, after one of Elizabeth's offspring was ill, she managed to convince him to take her to the hospital, and once they arrived, police were on site to detain them. After making sure she would never be forced to see her father again, Elizabeth told authorities everything that her father ever did to her and her little ones, and Fritzl was sentenced to life for his crimes. Coming in at number 2, Gary Ridgway. Gary grew up in a troubled household with very little stability, which led to him wetting the bed well into his teen years. However, after each incident, his mother would clean him up, leading Gary to have conflicting feelings of both anger and desire towards his mother, often fantasizing about killing her and doing unspeakable things to her corpse. When he got older, he joined the military, and it was during his time in combat that he became obsessed with escorts. Once he returned back to America, his first marriage ended quickly after his wife discovered he had given her multiple infections. Soon after, he married again, this time finding salvation in the church. He forced his wife into a staunch and devout life, but in contrast, kept his ravenous appetite for inappropriate relations with those whose company he paid for. But Ridgway had an inner conflict about his desires, and so he started strangling the women after he had got what he wanted from them, dumping their brutalized bodies into the woods. Disgustingly, it was later revealed by one of his wives that he would often ask to have relations in the woods. At the time, she didn't know why, but during investigations, multiple of his victims were found buried in those woods, and authorities believe he got pleasure from being in the area. Upon his arrest, he was officially convicted for taking 49 lives, but during trial, he famously said he had killed so many that he lost count, and that he didn't even know the real number anymore. Last up in our number 1 spot, Edmund Kemper. One of the most notorious killers of the 20th century, early on, Kemper showed signs of strange behavior. It started out with torturing insects, but by age 10, he buried his pet cat alive, waited for it to die, then dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike. From there, things only got more concerning. By the age of 13, his parents divorced and his mother became his sole parental figure. However, she was an abusive alcoholic who mocked and humiliated the boy, and so their relationship turned into an extremely toxic one. At 14, Kemper ran away from home to try and be with his father, but eventually ended up living with his grandparents, and that is where things got really bad. At age 15, he killed killed both his grandparents and was arrested for the crimes. However, due to his age, he didn't face any criminal charges. By 1969, on his 21st birthday, he was released on parole against his psychologist's warning and sent to live with his mother. Kemper, however, hated his mother, and the two fought non-stop. By 1972, he began seeking out college student victims after a fight with his mother, and by 1973, he had taken the lives of 8 different women this way, becoming known in the public as the co-ed killer. Finally, in April of 1973, he bludgeoned his mother in her sleep before doing awful, unspeakable things to her decapitated head, and then called over her best friend and killed her too before turning himself in. In the end, Kemper was sentenced to life in prison despite his request to be tortured to death.